In this video, we're going to practice going from percent to decimals and to decimals to percent. This is called converting. So what you just heard me say were opposites, right? Percent to decimal, decimal to percent. So the way that we'll do those things are going to be opposite as well. So let's start with converting percents to decimals. There are a couple ways we can go about doing this. The first way we'll practice is by dividing by 100. So you take the number that's in front of the percent sign. So our first example is 62%. So I would take 62 and divide it by 100. And you can use a calculator for this, but when you do 62 divided by 100, the result is 0.62 or 62 hundredths. So our next example would be 3%. So I would take 3 divided by 100, and that would get me 0.03 or 3 hundredths. Our last example is 94%. So I would take 94 divided by 100, and that would get me 0.94 or 94 hundredths. Another option when you're converting percents to decimals is to take the number in front of the percentage sign and move the decimal point 2 spaces to the left. So what do I mean by that? So I've got 19%. So I will write 19. If I don't see a decimal point in my number, that means it's at the very end. So I can write one there if I want to. And then I want to move it 2 spaces to the left. So 1, 2, and my new decimal point goes there. So my answer would be 0.19 or 19 hundredths. Let's try that with 5%. So I'll write 5. My decimal place would be here. I'm going to move it over 2 spaces and put my new decimal point. Now, notice here there's an empty space. If I have an empty space, I can fill it in with a 0. So 5% written as a decimal would be 0.05 or 5 hundredths. Our last example for this would be 58%. So I'll write 58. I don't see a decimal point, so that's at the end here. I'm going to move it 2 spaces to the left, 1, 2. So 58% written as a decimal would be 0.58. Now let's practice moving from decimal to percent. So notice that is the opposite direction. So we are going to do the opposite of what we just did to go from percent to decimal. So again, we've got 2 different options here. Our first would be to multiply by 100. So our first example is 0.44 or 44 hundredths. If I want to multiply that times 100, you can use your calculator again if you like. It will get me 44. And then I need to add my percent sign on the end because now it's a percent. So let's try this with the second example, 0.02 or 2 hundredths. Again, I'm going to multiply by 100. And that will get me 2. And I put my percent sign on the end. Last example up here, 0.71 or 71 hundredths times 100 will get me 71. And then I add my percent sign onto the end. Just like before when we went from percent to decimals, I could move my decimal place 2 spaces to the left. If I'm going from decimal to percent, I can do the opposite and move it 2 spaces to the right. So I've got 0.32 here, or 32 hundredths. So I see my decimal right here, and I'm going to count over 1, 2. And that leaves me with 32. Then we add percent. Here, we've got 0.07. I'm going to move my decimal 2 spaces to the right, 1, 2. Now that leaves me with 0.7. I don't need to write that 0 out in front of a 7 when it's a whole number, so I will just write 7%. Our last example which I didn't change, so let's change it. Our last example will be 0.14 or 14 hundredths. So I'm going to move my decimal place 2 spaces to the right, and now I have 14%.